Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
All right. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Kelly Paxton, the pink collar crime lady, as she is otherwise known. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Kelly before we get into it. So Kelly has had a very diverse background, very unique background, I would say. She spent the early portion of her career working as a special agent for U.S. Customs, dealing with white collar fraud, money laundering, and narcotics. She then went on to work in both the public and private sector, including working at Nike and doing some investigations for the Department of Homeland Security, which is quite interesting. She is also known, as I mentioned earlier, that she is known as the pink collar crime lady. She does keynotes and she does training to corporations around the globe. She is very well known in space and very busy. And she is the author of the terrific book Embezzlement: How to Detect, Prevent, and Investigate Pink Collar Crime. And I would highly recommend, especially if you have an interest, not only if you have an interest in fraud, but if you're a small business owner and there's things that keep you up at night, I would highly recommend you take a read of Kelly's book, because it's really not just designed for accountants. If anything, it might be more appropriate for non-accountants to take a read of that book and make sure that they understand where the risk is. So, Kelly, thank you very much for joining. And I'm going to start this interview in a bit of a controversial way. We're taping this a couple weeks before the holidays. And, and I want to get you a little bit fired up before we get into this. Hopefully this doesn't result in you exiting this interview 30 seconds in, but I couldn't resist the temptation. So I've read your book, I've done all my research, and I just want to make sure that I've got this right. Okay. So after all of this, my understanding is the following as it relates to women and fraud, is that women would never, ever commit corporate fraud for a number of reasons. Is that, number one, all women are just far too kind and trusting and would never steal money from their employer. That would be reason number one. Reason number two is that you outline in your book, early on in your book, you say statistically most, and I believe it's around 90%, most violent crimes are committed by men. So I would assume that this trend would also apply to women as well, or it applied to financial crimes, is that if 90% of violent crimes are committed by committed by men, then I would assume that 90% of financial crimes would also be committed by men. I'm just assuming that. And then the last story, which I'm not going to share, because if I shared this story, Kelly, I would get a knock on the door from HR, and I would probably be out of a job sending you a resume. It's wondering if Kelly Paxton is hiring, but I would recommend everybody buy Kelly's book. Turn to page 7, and Dr. Sigmund Freud actually outlines a reason why there's a very small group of women who would actually commit crime. And I'm not going to relay it here because, again, I might find myself out of a job. But the rationale relates to certain jealousy that women have in relation to men, and that is why certain women commit crimes. Now, again, I can't actually tell the story because I might find myself on the unemployment block. But pick up Kelly's book, turn to page 7, and she's got a nice little couple paragraphs in there about Dr. Sigmund Freud's rationale for why women commit crime. So after all my research, Kelly, can you let me know if I have my conclusion right? Are women just not going to commit any sort of corporate fraud? Is that do I have that right or not?
That would be very, very wrong.
At least you're blunt. At least you're right to the point. So tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, okay. So there's a lot of reasons that you're wrong, but I'm going to say one of the more prevalent reasons now is that women are in the workforce and women are providers and they need to provide. And so in the past, women had certain ways to be able to provide, and I'll get canceled if I say the ways that they are to provide. And I got this from Dr. Frida Adler, who was kind of the first person in 1975. She wrote Sisters in Crime, The Rise of the New Female Criminal, and she got pushed back for 3 years. And she's like, women have always been able to make ends meet. They did it differently. Now they're in businesses. And so let's just say that, and please don't cancel me for this, even though I'm shocked I haven't been fully canceled yet, is that say that you work for a dentist, and actually 3 out of 5 dentists get ripped off. So you dentists out there.
Wow.
Yeah. So say you work for a dentist, but you go home that night and your water heater is broken. Now, before you worked for the dentist, you're going to call Joe the plumber. And Joe the plumber is going to come over, and you will, figure out a way to pay Joe the plumber. Now you work at the dentist office, and you're like, I don't like Joe the plumber. I'm going to call ABC Plumbing, and I'm going to send them to my house to fix my hot water heater, and I'm just going to have the dentist pay for it. And the dentist doesn't know that he's not going to read the invoice that said it went to, 123 Hollyhock Street instead of 123 Main Street.
Yep.
And so you're like, that was easy. And they need hot water. So women are put more in a position of having to, I grew up in a very traditional household. My mom stayed home until my parents split up, and then my mom had to go to work. But now women need to bring home the bacon and fry it up in a pan.
Yep.
And so, and you have the fraud triangle, which is opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. For a long time, women didn't have opportunity. Now they have opportunity because 90% of all bookkeepers in the United States are women, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Wow.
So they're the ones who know every dime that goes in and every dime that goes out. And do you think the dentist or even the plumbing contractor looks at the invoices? No, they're lucky to look at their bank statement. Now, this is another thing that I'm going to jump right into. I'm the fraud #queen. Follow me on LinkedIn. #no victim shaming. I am not going to victim shame the dentist for not catching that ABC Plumbing went to Gladys's house. Because if we start making the victims feel bad that they were ripped off by that nice little old lady or that nice, cute young lady, they won't turn these cases into law enforcement. It's embarrassing. So I will not victim shame.
Well, look, the reality is that if you've been around long enough, you're going to get burned, right? Like literally, no matter how sophisticated or smart you are, or you think you are, nobody is going to go through and check every single invoice. That's just not, that's just not practical. At some point there is an element of trust, you know what I mean? That exists. So, the honest answer is that if you've worked long enough, you're a victim. Now I'm sure there's different levels. Some people have been victimized more than others, but if you've been around the block long enough and you haven't been victimized, it's just a matter of time, before you get burned, right? It's just, it is what it is. Is that fair?
Yeah. And again, you don't go to your dentist because he's good with,
100%.
the P&L, or she's good with the P&L. You don't go to the electrician because
100%.
you go to them for their skill, and their skill is the bigger picture. They're again, but you have trust but verify.
Yep.
Now, you go into the dentist, and I'm not picking on dentists. I have a great dentist, but I've given him my book, mind you, and I love his office manager. But if you go into the dentist and the dentist takes x-rays and he says you have a cavity, are you going to go prove it? Because there's been a study where they gave x-rays to however many dentists. 50% said there was a cavity, 50% said there wasn't.
Oh my
If
God.
you go into the dentist and say, prove it, you know what they're going to do? They're going to give that Novocaine and they're going to jab you.
Oh.
We have, you can't just keep asking everyone, is that a fresh avocado? Our world would come to a stop.
100%. 100% right. I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. Now, before we get into the fraud, we got to talk about your background, Kelly, because again, I think people need to understand you used to play with guns and stuff like that. Like you've got a don't mess with Kelly like background type of thing here. So maybe just back us up a little bit where did you kind of start your professional career? Because it wasn't in, going after, the 3 and 5 dentists that are getting ripped off. It was a different type of criminal that you were trying to track down. It wasn't the bookkeeper who was screwing over the dentist. It was a completely different type of character you're going after. So maybe just talk us through a little bit about your early days, because you got a really, really interesting background.
Well, it's interesting because I say that my career has always been about money. So I first was in finance. My dad was a commodities trader. I worked at the Chicago Board of Trade. I became a stockbroker and a bond trader. And we had a client who was pinky when I was at a stock firm. And I was young. And his name is Alan Taylor. This is all public record. He stole $150,000. He committed wire fraud. It was actually technically letter of credit fraud. But I knew the guy was dirty. And this was in the early 90s. It was before you had to know where your customers' money came from. Now you have KYC and anti-money laundering laws.
Mhm.
But so one day I'm sitting at the phones and I answer the phone as special agent from US Customs. And she's like, "Hey, do you know Alan?" And I giggled. I was like, "Oh, are we calling him Alan today or his name Winston?" And she's like, "Oh." And so she goes, "I'm going to send a subpoena down." Now, anyone out there, if you're an investigator, you never go to the local office. You go to the headquarters. So, of course, I tell the broker that, "Hey, someone's sniffing around Alan." And so Alan immediately cashes out. Now she got him. It's all good. And she ended up still hiring me. So all good. But then I became a special agent for US Customs. I had never touched a gun until I was 30. I went to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and I got to do all sorts of fun things and chase people and, shoot things up and all sorts of stuff. But because of my background was in finance, I primarily did money laundering cases, narcotics cases, and white collar crime. And again, this is a stereotype. I arrested bad guys. And we don't say bad women. I mean, there is a TV show called Bad Sisters, which is kind of delightful. But so, it was a certain type of criminal. I did get a woman lawyer disbarred and thrown in jail, but it was a white collar crime. It was not a pink collar crime. She tried to steal $2.4 million from a guy and we actually stopped it.
Wow.
But so then life happens and I end up coming back to Oregon eventually. And I get my certified fraud examiner designation and I go work for a local sheriff's office and I become their fraud analyst. And we're doing embezzlement cases on Main Street. And all of a sudden I'm like, you know what? All my suspects are women except for one dude. And this guy
Wow.
steals like a woman, which is, there are differences. Gender people, there are differences. So I Google women embezzlers and I come across the term pink collar crime. Now, hashtag, it's position, not gender. So all these women were stealing and they looked like me. They lived in my neighborhood. Their kids went to school with my kids. And I was like, where are the bad guys? Like, where
Yeah.
are they? No, these are bad women. And so then it really kind of rocked my world. And from then on, I have worked on my own. I worked at Nike. I'm back on my own teaching and training. And we have bias and we have stereotypes and we think that women don't do bad things, but they do.
So when you worked at the local sheriff's office, and what was a typical day in the life, like in terms of the typical crime that you would be investigating, or the typical embezzlement? Was there kind of, one that would reoccur on a regular basis in terms of like, steady Eddie type of thing?
Dentists.
Dentist. Oh, really? So the dentist
Yeah.
would call in, like the dentist would finally figure it out at some point that they'd be getting screwed and they would give you a call?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Also, like charter school, water district, municipalities. I'm trying to think of like, we had some trades, electricians, plumbers, home builders, construction. Because again, their genius is not in the money. Like, this is one example I use. If say you have a business on Main Street and you sell 1 million widgets a year, and you know that you net $10 a widget. Most business owners are calculating. They're
Yeah.
going, okay, I sold 1 million widgets. I make $10 a widget after everything. I should have $10 million in the bank. They are doing a mental calculation. They are not pulling out their statements going, okay, where's my $10 million? I listen to a lot of podcasts and I hear this one guy, he's a world famous speaker. He's a guy he's like Tony Robbins, and they're like, okay, so how do you keep track of your finances? And he goes, I have business manager. Every Friday morning, I get a phone call and my business manager tells me how much is in each of my 5 accounts. And I'm like, like he tells him, he doesn't look, he literally, and he's like, well, I just did this gig in this city. And, we're always doing, I do a mental tally. Like, okay, I have this many gigs this year. The average is this. I'm going to make about this much money. And we do that. But we need to, I don't know if I have it where you can see it, surprise and delight. I love to surprise and delight. If you are a business owner, you surprise and delight your employees, not your customers, your employees. So if you're you only look at checks over $5,000. Gladys, as I refer to her, knows that she can write a check for 4,000 and you're never going to look at it.
Yep.
So pull a check for 500 and ask for the backup. If the accountants or the auditors come every June, have them come in October and don't tell anyone. That's what I mean by surprise and delight.
So first thing we've got to do is define pink collar crime. You just made a good point that where you found somebody who was a woman who tried to steal, $2 million or whatever from somebody else. And you referred to that as a white collar crime as opposed to a pink collar crime. So it doesn't have anything to do with the gender. So maybe Kelly give us some perspective on what a pink collar crime is and maybe how that's different than what a white collar crime is.
Okay, so white collar is the umbrella. That is
That's everything.
all.
Okay. All
Pink
financial
collar
crime.
is like one of the little pockets.
Okay.
So the true definition of pink collar, and this was popularized by Dr. Kathleen Daly, a criminologist who now lives in Australia. It is low to medium level employees, primarily women, who steal from the workplace. So it is garden variety embezzlement. But if I said I'm the garden variety embezzlement expert, no one would pay any attention. And we do have other colors of crime, but the white is the big umbrella and the pink is the garden variety embezzlement. And so, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it just so happens, like you were saying, that the nature of that crime just happens to be where there's a high percentage of actually women that do those jobs is really what you're saying.
Yeah. So white collar, think of Bernie Madoff, Enron. So it's financial statement fraud. It's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It is Ponzi schemes. Now, we don't relate to Bernie because Bernie doesn't live amongst us.
Yeah.
We relate to Gladys.
Yep.
She just upgraded from a Corolla to a Camry.
Yep.
And we see her at the grocery store. We don't see Bernie.
So if you were to line up 15 of these people who when you were at the sheriff's office, let's say, tracked them down and convicted them. If you were to line them up in a line, what would be some of the characteristics of those, apart from a large percentage of them being female, just given the nature of the role? What would be some of the common characteristics among those 15 people?
No criminal history. Now, it doesn't mean they haven't done it before, but there is no criminal history. So they may have done it before, but the dentist said, Gladys, it's time you leave. And that's it. They would have no criminal history. They would be, and I don't want to be ageist. They're like middle-aged. I had a woman who was 67. I know someone who was 87 when she stole.
Wow.
So they're generally not in their 20s. Generally, I think it's going to age down a bit. they're primarily, in my case, and granted, I lived in a pretty non-diverse area. They were somewhat well-educated white women.
No, we're going to talk a little bit about the fraud triangle in a second, but the next question would be if they're run of the mill, the average women that's out there. Why does Bernie Madoff steal? Again, there's probably a bunch of reasons, but clearly one of them is makes millions and millions of dollars while doing it. You know, major incentive in order to commit the crimes. These crimes, the dollar numbers are a lot smaller. You mentioned a really good example at the outset about the plumber, where just I need to pay the bill for the plumber. What would be some of the common motivations for and how does somebody go from, let's say, a good upbringing to then crossing that line? So like, how do they cross and what are some of the motivations? Like, do they think they're doing anything wrong or they just think, you know what, I'm underpaid and therefore I deserve this extra amount?
So it's a little bit of all of that.
Got it.
But so I have a funny story from it's where I live now. And there was a guy and he had, I believe, a plumbing operation. And, your water heater or never goes out between 8 and 5. Never. So he tells his office manager, who, mind you, brings in cookies for the plumbers every week. She's beloved. She brings in cookies for the boys every week. And he's like, you know what? I need you to start taking the calls after 5. And she's like, yeah, that's not my job. And so she went out and actually found out how much an answering service would cost. And she takes it to her boss and he goes, I can't afford that. Now she knew he could afford that. And he goes, you're doing it. It's your job. So
Wow.
guess what? She started stealing. And I'm sure at first she probably was stealing just like, well, it's $1,200 to hire the answering service. So I'll just steal $1,200 this month. But it never stays like this. It
Yeah.
goes like that. So there's that, she was mad. She's just like, he could afford it because they know everywhere every penny is.
Yeah.
And he's just like, no, it's part of your job. And she didn't like getting phone calls at, 11, 2 in the morning saying that my water heater burst. And meanwhile, he's driving a brand new Ford F-150, or maybe it was a Ford F-350 or something like that. That's the one thing in the fraud triangle, opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. You can control for opportunity. Granted, your business is going to grind to a halt if you triple check everything. Rationalization is really hard to control for because you also get, say, Gladys and her partner leaves her. One of her parents gets sick. Her
Yep.
kid gets thrown in jail. And she's like, I need money. I know a
Yeah.
woman who stole. She was a second marriage. Her kid was having some challenges, and her second husband's like, your kid is just a problem. They had money jointly to pay for her kid for an attorney, but she knew if she took it out of their joint account, the husband would know. And then he'd say, I told you so. So she starts stealing because
Yeah.
she couldn't let her husband be right about her kid. Now her kid is doing great now, but I think she stole $350,000.
Wow.
And it was because her kid got in trouble and she couldn't tell her second husband that her kid from her first marriage was having challenges. And she started stealing to bail him out. So, we're going through life like this. And then all of a sudden something happens.
Yep.
Her name is Maxine Brink, I believe. Her husband got cancer at 87. She stole money, she said, to feed him.
Wow.
Given the irony of what's happening in our country right now and the whole healthcare crisis. I mean, you guys are civilized up north. My husband had cancer, and luckily we had good insurance. But like, what if you don't?
100%. No, I totally agree with you.
I never, there's no justification for it, but I'm just saying it is what people go through in their head.
So they rationalize it. And when you catch them and you get them dead to rights, because a lot of this stuff, there's a paper trail and you can probably, you can catch them, I mean, like it's not, maybe some of these other crimes, a lot more might be difficult to prove. But in the case of financial crimes, in a lot of cases, there's a paper trail that you can follow, bank statements and purchases and Visa. And, not much is bought with cash anymore, especially if it's a large purchase. So when you catch them, and you're probably catching them dead to rights, what do they say? Or do they feel bad about it, or they kind of justify, try and justify what they've done?
So unless they're a serial embezzler, they will cough it up. A lot of them have kept track of the number.
Yeah.
Granted, whatever the number they say, if they say they stole 100,000, realistically, they sold 2 to 600,000. I called it the 2 to 6 factor because we always round down. It's like, oh yeah, we, bought something for 4,900, 2,500. So
Yeah.
they round down. A lot of them think that they will pay it back. They rarely do. I've seen some instances where they paid a little bit, but then they keep stealing, so they pay a little bit back. The woman who stole $1 million from a dentist, she had a raging gambling addiction problem, whatever you want to call it. Now, if she had gone and bought Powerball and won $250 million, and she puts $1 million back into the bank and does a journal entry, I still think the dentist is going to say, where'd that $1 million come from? So it's hard to put money back in the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because- So yeah, that's challenging.
And maybe just give us some sense on statistics. You talked about dentists. 3 in 5 dentists are getting ripped off. If you look in the corporate world, I'm guessing you have no shortage of work in terms of speaking to people about fraud and white collar, pink collar crimes. Give us some just sense of how prevalent this is, because the other thing too, be interested to know is, I'm not sure how many people actually, like the dentist, actually prosecute the criminal, because that's a pain in the ass to do it. It costs money. But maybe just give us scare us a little bit with some statistics, Kelly, because I'm sure you talk about rounding down, but I bet you the numbers are actually pretty scary in terms of how prevalent some of this stuff is throughout, call it the US/Canada.
Yeah. So the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners says that 5% of all, earnings is sucked off to fraud.
Wow.
They say, not they, but there's a number out there that says only 15% of embezzlement cases get turned into law enforcement. David Weber, who's a professor at Salisbury University, he actually did using hard statistics, a study of 10 years of federal embezzlement cases in the United States. Women out embezzled men by, I believe it's 13%.
Wow.
And that's only federal cases. Now, when I was working at the sheriff's office, those were local municipal cases. A lot of times the feds in the United States aren't interested in the, $35,000 dental embezzlement or the $75,000, I won't say water district because that's a government sort of entity, but the feds they've got limited resources, and the local law enforcement has limited resources. So say you have a serial rapist or a serial murderer in your community, and you've got a business that's successful and they've been ripped off $500,000. The cops are like, we've got dead bodies. We've got, a rapist in town, and sorry, but you're going to have to hire a lawyer. That's the other thing, is a lot of these cases, sometimes law enforcement will say it's a civil matter. Like, you just need to go sue them. Well, most cops, with the exception of me, don't become law enforcement to play with Excel and pivot tables.
Yeah.
And in some jurisdictions, if you get sent to the fraud or the white collar area, it's kind of considered a demotion. It's like,
Yeah.
what'd you do to get sent over there? Cops become cops because they like to, go to the shooting range. They don't like to, do pivot tables.
Is there a view too that some of this stuff is a victimless crime, where you take a dentist maybe making $500,000 a year, has 3 houses, his cottage, his boat, blah, blah, blah. And you say, look, 40 grand, 50 grand, it's a drop in the bucket. You know what I mean? Like that's a nice present for his wife type of thing, right? That's a net nothing. Is that kind of a rationalization as well, that we're dealing with kind of a victimless crime per se, that at least in the eyes of some?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Like, that's why I say no victim shaming, because if
Yeah.
we do that, then people aren't going to come forward.
Yeah.
And I say, I want to normalize embezzlement, not the act of it, but the reporting of it. So And, let's just say 50 years ago, if someone was a victim of a sexual assault and they actually turn it into law enforcement and it went to trial, the first thing the defense attorney said, "What were you wearing then?"
Yep. Yep.
I don't want someone who goes to law enforcement says like, "Well, that's a nice Range Rover you got out there. Like,
Yep.
obviously you don't get to buy a new one next year because you got
Yeah.
ripped off 50 grand." Like, it's just, we have to normalize that embezzlement and fraud happen.
Yep.
So that's kind of like, I kind of consider this my best work I've done, is to get people talking about it. I'll go to a cocktail party, I'll meet someone, they'll ask what I do. And they're like, "Well, I have a friend." And Kevin Bacon's 6 degrees of separation, embezzlement is at most 2. I can go in my neighborhood. I did a podcast with one of my neighbors who does supply chain stuff. And sure enough, he's like, "Oh, yeah, my dad was ripped off." My late father in law, who was a neurosurgeon, there was talk that he had been ripped off by that nice office manager. I mean, my dad was ripped off by his office manager slash side piece.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the other thing is these women, and this is again, cancel. No, not they have a get out of jail free card because you know what? They know what is happening. So there was a woman in Portland, Oregon who stole from an abortion clinic. Now, it was a business. The woman who owned the abortion clinic was a business owner. And she catches her, Gladys, and Gladys says to the business owner, "I know you pay for your kid's car. I know you pay your house utilities out of the business. I'm going to turn you into the IRS and the state." And luckily, the business owner said, "Fine, do it."
Yeah.
And she called her bluff. But so many times that Gladys, she knows everything. She knows that, you're sending flowers to not your wife or you're taking a trip.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you have to be careful about that. And, I never want to say hire an attorney. You must have an attorney. I know a guy who bought a house from one of his clients because his client falsely accused his office manager of stealing. And she took him to court and he had to sell his house to pay the judgment. So you have to you would never want to falsely accuse someone of stealing. Chipotle falsely accused an employee of stealing. They got a jury verdict of $8 million. You do not falsely accuse. This is not,
Especially in the US. Some of those
yeah,
jury verdicts in the US are just insane, right? In terms of this concept of penal, you know what I mean? Like
punitive. Yeah.
punitive related damages, right? That can pretty much just skyrocket. So
Yeah.
that's great advice is, when you run into an issue, your first call is probably to a lawyer. You know what I mean? Just making sure that everything, because if you can't prove it, it's going to be a problem. You know what I mean? If you don't have the evidence to actually back up what you're saying, presumably that's going to be a problem for you. So
Well, and like the Chipotle case, they said they had video of a manager taking cash out of a safe. And she knew she hadn't. So she got a lawyer. And the lawyer said, "Show us the videotape." And they're like, "Oh, oops, we lost it." And it turns out they were retaliating against her. And the point I like to make in the Chipotle case is, what if she had taken $800 out of the safe? The week before, they ran out of avocados and she ran to the local grocery and bought $800 worth of avocados. So she was just paying herself back. Seeing that video for that one clip, that doesn't tell you the whole story. You got to go front, back, and sideways.
well, and the other thing, I was told by a former RCMP officer who actually I think worked in the U.S. for a bit as a DEA agent, but he now specializes in forensic crimes. And he had told me they caught somebody dead to rights, and so they interview the guy and they say, "We got you." He goes, "You got me." He goes, "All the executives are doing the exact same thing. So this is
Get
the
out of
corporate
jail.
culture." Yeah, exactly. Like, how can I be doing something offside if my boss and everybody else are basically doing the exact same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But the ACFE in their survey, the report to the nation, the higher up you go, the less amount of punishment.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing to say that someone in the C-suite has been embezzlement. And if you do have, say, a C-suite sort of environment and you do take it to law enforcement, they are going to say this is a civil matter. It's just a bunch of rich guys arguing that, you took the corporate jet and I didn't get the corporate jet. And, so the higher up you go, there's a different sort of system, let's say, for that level.
So the other question I want to ask you is before I met you, I knew about white collar crime, obviously. Then I met you and I learned a little bit about pink collar crime. And then you had told me something about red collar crime as well. So Kelly, maybe just give us some perspective here. Like how many different colors are we talking about? We've got maybe I know white, I know pink. Maybe just give us some perspective on red, because red is pretty hardcore. And how many other colors of the rainbow are we talking about here?
Well, so red is a financial crime, and I hope you have Frank Perry on a future episode. He's wonderful. He's my highest downloaded episode, and I've had him on twice. On financial crime turns bloody, like, fatal, blood fatal. And so that's red color crime. You have gray color crime, which Christina Fasella has coined that term.
Oh.
It is older people committing crime. She is as a good example of an older couple, has a lot of jewelry. They retire. They still have the Mercedes in the driveway. Their, savings are going down like this. Again, this is the United States. Her example is there's one person, the husband gets sick. They've got to raise some money to pay some hospital bills. So the
Yeah.
woman says that her jewelry's been stolen,
Oh,
and it
really?
wasn't. But I hope you have Christina on, the woman that she's just like, insurance. People are like, we paid into it for so long. We're just getting our premiums back. It's like, that's not how insurance works. And I would tell anyone, do not commit insurance fraud. These insurance agencies or companies, they know your patterns. My insurance is through like my banking. It's a big umbrella of financial services. They know everything about me.
Yeah.
They know how much on average I spend per month. I just looked at my bank account and they're like, you're spending less than last month by $882.12. And I'm like, oh my, like they know everything. So if all of a sudden you're like doing all sorts of stuff, never commit insurance fraud. I should become an insurance like evangelist for do not commit insurance fraud. That's the other thing is these insurance companies, they've got power. They can go to local law enforcement and say, this person needs to be prosecuted. Whereas mom and pop grocery store, they don't.
Yeah, well, and we always like to complain about stuff. And, one of the things where you get a lot of complaints is on insurance premiums. Yeah, the reality is that if you eliminated fraud from insurance, I'd be very interested to know how far those insurance rates would decline, because I bet you that's double digits, and it's probably pretty significant just in terms of how much a premium we're paying in order to reimburse the insurance company effectively for all the fraud that they have to deal with. Because I can imagine the number is significant, is very, very high, and it's not that easy to catch necessarily. You know what I mean? Like you
Well,
bang up
and
your
people
car and
also, they're like, I've been paying into this. I have never made a claim my whole entire
oh
life.
yeah, oh yeah, exactly.
I just found out I've been with my insurance company 35 years. I had a question about something. They're like, thank you for being a member for 35 years. They have 35 years of data on me.
Yeah.
They know when I burp.
So we've got white, pink, red, gray. Are we missing any colors there, Kelly, or does that pretty much cover everything?
That's pretty much, I mean, they say that there's, like green crime, which is environmental crime. I don't know any specialist in that.
Okay.
You know, they say blue collar crime, but what is blue collar? I just, again, it's a little bit different. These ones are more the financial ones that fit under the white collar umbrella.
Got it.
So, yeah.
So then maybe just talk a little bit about the fraud triangle, because does the fraud triangle, look, there's obviously going to be consistencies in each of those colors. Is the fraud triangle consistent to maybe just talk a little bit about the fraud triangle? And is it consistent to all the colors of, call it everything in this white collar bucket? Maybe one of the few consistencies that does exist, but maybe just talk a little bit about the fraud triangle and how it relates to, some of the different colors.
So it was in the 1950s by Donald Cressy, and you have opportunity, pressure, and rationalization. Now, opportunity you can kind of lock down. Pressure, we had COVID. You had
Yep.
doctors that had $1 million a year salary. All of a sudden, they can't do hip replacements. And, that was a pressure. COVID became a huge financial pressure for people.
Absolutely.
And then you have rationalization. And again, you could be paying Gladys $1 million a year to run your, veterinary clinic. But if she has a $2 million lifestyle, she will steal. And then the other thing is like, I have a colleague, Leah, we told her, who she went into a business in the Midwest and the guy thought he was getting ripped off. And so he goes around and says, well, this person does this and this person does that. And then he goes to his assistant, Gladys, and he's like, oh, don't look at anything Gladys does. She's too stupid to steal from me. He literally said that. Guess who stole? Gladys. Like, and so a guy who literally, or a business owner who says that, how do you think the culture is of that business?
Absolutely.
That's where the rationalization, you're in there, you get in at 7, you stay until 6 p.m. at night, and your boss is out gallivanting the countryside, writing off family trips on, taxes, things like that, driving a nice Range Rover, and you can't send your kid to outdoor school, and your boss isn't nice to you. And we can't control what goes on in someone's head. We just can't. Culture is so important. If you don't want your employees to steal, don't do stuff that they're smart. They see you.
Yeah.
Model good behavior. So when you take a trip, like you go to a convention, you take your family and you come back and you give your Black American Express bill and you get to stay at the nicest hotel in Aspen and you literally go into the trade show for 20 minutes and you write up a $20,000 vacation, they know you're stealing. They
Yeah.
know you're not paying taxes on that money. Now, what they don't know is if you are a legitimate business person, at the end of the year, you're going to take a customer and owner's draw. But they might not see that. So explain to Gladys, say, here's my $20,000 bill. I'm going to count the flight from me there, one night hotel, food and beverage for 2 days. And then the rest of the trip, don't write off. Just add it to my paycheck. And then Gladys is like, oh, he or she's doing the right thing. But how many people don't do that? They're like, it's my business. It's my money. Just do your work.
And Gladys is too stupid, like you say, right? Like if that's really what they're thinking, they're not that rationalization is not going to cross their mind. She's just going to do exactly what she's told. What he chooses to do with his or her business is his problem and, or his issue. And that anybody who's then working under him is just too stupid to figure it out. You could totally see how that works. You know what I mean? Or that works at least in his mind or her mind, whoever that business owner is. And then you've got someone, the Gladys, the office manager, basically totally, saying, hey, this is not right. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's just, you got to have a good culture. It's just when they see you making bad decisions, it's a creep. It's a little creep. Like Gladys is never going to steal $750,000 in one check. There's a guy who he's still alive. He stole from a public school district in New York. And he says it started with 2 Greek salads and 2 Cokes and they didn't catch it. And he ended up stealing almost $2 million. And it's like, it's never one check for $750,000. It's over time and it never goes down. It's like when you get a raise, they say, don't live on the raise, put that into savings or your retirement. But who does that?
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, well, and I mean, I joke that like, you no longer buy the generic shampoo, you buy the fancy, really good smelly stuff that,
Yeah.
just make your hair luscious. You can get used to it. it's lifestyle creep.
It's, and there's a concept in accounting, timing, everything reverses, and you put it away, and at the outset, it's these small amounts. And like you say, you're probably rounding down in your head all the time. And then you actually get caught, or you realize that you're in a hole that you can't get out of, and the number's massive. And there's no, like, again, you can't put in $1 million in the business to reimburse them when you've been stealing 100 grand per year for the last 10 years. It doesn't work like that, because it's going to stick out like a sore thumb, right? Like, it's just, it builds, you know what I mean? And like many things in accounting, and it reverses at some point, and when it reverses, it can be a massive number when that actually happens. So
Hashtag no one steals to save.
yeah, that's
I've got all sorts of fun hashtags.
that's a yeah, no, that's right. That's a good, that makes total sense. Yeah. So give us some examples of how you talked a bunch about, some of these common schemes. Maybe just give us some perspective on the mechanics on if someone's going to commit a pink collar crime, what are like the top, 2 or 3 ways in which they're going to could do it. Talked a little bit about checks, and I don't know how it is in the US, but checks up in Canada are starting to really decline. Like in Europe, I think they don't even cut checks anymore. Like it's not even part of the equation. But maybe just talk a little bit about, because one of them I think is check writing and screwing with the cash numbers. But maybe, yeah, just talk a little bit about some of the common ways in which the pink collar criminals are able to kind of extract cash or extract proceeds from the underlying business.
So yeah, this is funny. And this is also going to be a little bit of an age and technology thing. My kids are in their 20s. They've never written a check a day in their life. They don't even have a check. Like
Yep.
if they need a check, it's me writing the check and giving it to them for whatever they need it for. But the number one way is forged or unauthorized checks. Now, I also joke that like there's a gender difference. If I say I'm out of the country and I need a check written, I'm going to call my daughter, even though my daughter's the one who's out of the country. And I'm going to say, can you just go into my office, pull out a check, write it, and sign my name? I would never ask my son to do it because he should be a doctor because he can't sign his name. So that's a gender sort of thing. Like, generally speaking, women have nicer handwriting than men. If I needed something to be forged, I would ask my daughter. Now, and this is from Chris Marquet, and he doesn't do it anymore, but he used to do an embezzlement report, and he found that men embezzled more via vendors. And again, think about the position. They're in procurement, they're in supply chain. And so it's like, you could run 2 invoices through.
Yeah.
And then you call your buddy at the pipe company and say, you know what, we overpaid you. Can you just cut a check back to, instead of, ABC company, just cut it back to A. And then you've got an account that's A. And then you get a deposit into the bank. So there's shenanigans that go on like that. Then there's cash, and some like I pay my water bill online. Not everyone does that. And when I had an investigation of the sheriff's office, now this was, more than 10 years ago, it was all cash. And I'm like, who pays their water bill via cash? And I'm like, oh, I bet my brother does.
Yeah.
And so we have to have these different experiences. So like there are people that pay by cash.
Yeah.
So you've got to look at the industry. And so, I mean, I'm probably pretty sure my brother does pay bills via cash or something, or the last minute he runs in and gets a money order. If you don't know how other people live, you don't know how other people can potentially steal from you. And not to pick on dentists. There was a dentist a long time ago who he had no idea. He was an old school dentist. It was in the Midwest. He had no idea that he took cash in his practice. He just figured everyone had insurance. And no, the office manager was getting cash and she just back out the treatments. He had no idea that he assumed because he had insurance, everyone else had insurance. And was wrong about that. That's why I love auditors. Auditors go in and they know how processes work. I was just looking at like my Myers-Briggs from 10 years ago, and it said I should have been an auditor. Number one job, it said I should have been an auditor. And I love auditors because they go in, they see how it works, and they see how it could better work. And I love that.
Hmm. And it's their job in order to, y- y- any auditor who believes that, their job is a commodity is probably not a very good auditor. I
Right.
think the auditors should be out there really trying to demonstrate value and, which differentiates them from their competition. And I totally agree with you. One of the ways to demonstrate value is to illustrate, to say, look, you're a small business. Here are some, I know you're not getting ripped off. However, here's a bunch of suggestions on how to improve your internal controls in order to make it better. Because I've seen other companies in your space who have gotten screwed over because they didn't have these. You know what I mean? So no, I totally agree with you. Is that it's not a commodity. It's the good ones are going to demonstrate value, right?
So we had a client. He ended up not being a client because he couldn't afford us. I'm not cheap, and lawyers are involved and everything like that. And he was a silent partner, and it was an automobile like repair. And the partnership agreement said cash would never be taken. It would always be Visa or check. And he thought that his partner that worked in the business was taking cash. He said the numbers were off, but he couldn't afford to hire us. So like the third time he came in, I said, dude, mystery shop it. And he's like, what? And I said, get someone who your friend doesn't know is your friend. Send that person in to get a lube oil change and have him try and pay cash. And if the guy takes cash, bingo! Like this is where the creativity. And
Absolutely.
he walked out of there and he's like, wow, I could just have someone go in and try and pay cash. And if the guy takes the cash, I know he's been doing it. I'm like, uh-huh. So creativity. And I think auditors are very good when it comes to creative thinking.
I agree. I agree with you. What about credit cards? I know as a sports fan, we had saw in Jacksonville, the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think there was a guy there who ripped off somewhere in the neighborhood
22
of
million.
22 million on a freaking credit card. I don't know. Again, I don't know all of the details. Maybe you know a lot more about it than me, but I looked at that number and say, how is it possible? And to charge 22 million bucks on credit cards, like, I can't imagine they're paying salaries on a friggin' credit card, right? Type of thing. But give us what are some best practices on credit cards? Because again, you have these, do you use a corporate card? Should people use a personal card? And how prevalent is credit card fraud in the, on the hit list of like common ways to rip off the business?
It's pretty popular. So I don't know if you guys could do this up north, but like in the States, you can go get your car filled with gas and they've got like a little mini mart there and you go in and you can buy all sorts of other stuff. It's not
Absolutely.
just the
Yeah. Oh yeah.
gas. So, and then, I worked at Nike and we had certain rules that like the MCC merchant codes, like for porn, if that merchant comes up on the thing, it gets declined.
Yep.
So you can make it so certain merchant codes aren't allowed as a preventative measure. But
I see.
again, this is sort of the surprise and delight. I have a picture from a long time ago on LinkedIn where I went into Costco and I put a bunch of like medical like gloves, the like gloves for doctor's offices. I filled my cart with a bunch of those gloves. And then I put in some really fancy like lotions and I took a picture of it. And it's like, does the business actually, they see 20 boxes of gloves
No.
and then they don't look and see that there's
No.
perfume and there's fancy shampoo and, so again, the surprise and delight, like just in audits, like the idea of an audit is you just test. And so you randomly pull certain things, but no, it's like certain places have more of a chance to steal than other places. I'm going to say Costco is one because they're getting a lot of stuff for maybe your small business and you send Gladys to do it. I mean, I had a friend whose brother, she went into Costco to fill up the like brake grip
Yep.
and she started buying clothes.
Yeah.
And the guy who stole like a woman at the sheriff's office, he was caught because of Costco. He had a sick child and he bought bunk beds.
Wow.
And so, like Costco, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of very legitimate things at Costco, but there's also probably a lot of not legitimate things at Costco. And Costco takes credit cards.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, credit cards are like, again, it makes life a lot easier. You don't have to do it. You give them a company card. So then you don't have to do the expense report on a personal card. And something that makes it easy to do commerce also can make it easy to do fraud.
Absolutely. Now, I was reading your book, and I have to admit, Kelly, you talked a lot about trust and verify. I read something in your book that I trusted was true, but I had to verify it because I didn't believe it. And that is Netflix's expense report policy. So if I understand this correctly, Netflix expense policy is a nice one-liner. Now, I don't know if that's still the case, but the
I
policy
think
is
it's changed
basically
recently.
the policy is, and again, I actually had to look this up because I didn't believe it. The policy, at least at one time, was act in Netflix's best interest. And we talked about auditors. I can't imagine how an auditor could possibly check that to see, is you could just imagine, you talk about creativity, there's a lot of things that would be in the company's best interest, at least depending on who you speak to. Is that, have you seen many companies with that? Like, what's your 2 cents on that sort of, that? No, because that's a US public SEC registrar, like legit company, right? That clearly they must have had a lot of thought. And if we had a Netflix person on with us, they could probably explain the reasons why, and they could maybe provide some pretty convincing arguments as to why that was an appropriate policy for them. And I could certainly listen and understand and maybe even agree with a lot of what they were saying. Maybe just give us your perspective on simplifying it quite that, like, should you have a 30 pager or a 100 pager, or should it just be a one liner like Netflix?
Yeah. So I will not say where I worked, but like, what about a $10,000 dinner for four at Nobu?
Hmm.
Is that ever acceptable? It is, maybe, because
Yeah,
maybe you're
depending on the
taking out.
industry. Yeah, depending on the industry for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Now, is it acceptable for a high performer and not acceptable for, say, like a very low level employee? So Netflix, I think they may have had to change that. I can't Google it right now because I'll get all dragged down into a rabbit hole. I love the policy. Unfortunately, what is it? 2 to 4% of the population are like psychopaths or narcissists. There's always be someone who pushes the envelope.
Yeah.
Now, this leads to, and I can't remember because it'll be 4 years tomorrow that this book got published. And I remember the date because it was my mom's birthday. So, but, oh God, now I've lost my train of thought. Okay, no. Oh dear, I've lost my train of thought.
The Netflix expense policy and saying, is it the right, is it the right approach to really simplify things down? Because I could also understand Netflix's position in saying, look, if someone's going to steal from us, whether our expense report policy is a sentence or whether it's 50 pages, they're probably going to do it either way. You know what I mean? And really what then it gets down to is, should I come
Lawyers.
up with, yeah, exactly, lawyers. And the reality is, as much as we like to joke that you could drive a train or a truck through a one sentence, you could probably drive a truck through a 50-page policy too. Like, again, you made it perfect, is that a $10,000 dinner, you'd say, well, at the outset, that sounds expensive, but $10,000 dinner in New York City amongst a bunch of bankers who are taking out a client that spends 15 million bucks a year at their business, $10,000 dinner, that sounds pretty reasonable. You know what I mean? Like, that's not out of line. And that's, I just wonder, again, maybe it is better to have a one liner as your expense report policy.
So this is, okay, I came back to my thought. I caught it. So hashtag tips find fraud. So
Right.
you know what? I don't, the aptonyms for whistleblowers are terrible, or not aptonyms, the synonyms. If you put into the Google machine what synonyms are for whistleblower, it's rat, snitch, fink, all very negative words. You know
Yep.
what? People don't like to see their coworker drive in a brand new Range Rover talking about how they flew first class over to Europe and blah, 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 blah. And you know what? You need to have an alert line. like a whistleblower line, because we don't like unfairness. And when you see, Sally or Joe next to you taking advantage of that one-liner policy, it's not good. And
Yep.
eventually something will cause it. And so businesses need to have alert lines. They need to have a method to report. My biggest cases have come from people telling bad acts of other people. And whether it's anonymous, the two biggest cases I had were anonymous. Did I know who the person was? Yes. But we don't do that because whistleblowers are retaliated against. You need to have a mechanism to do it. What happens if your boss is the one who is, blowing the expense policy?
Yep.
You can't go to your boss. You got to go to your boss's boss. And so yeah, tips find fraud. Make it so that the workers, and even one of my big tips came from an outside consultant,
Yeah.
and they knew what they were asked to do was wrong. So you have to have that. And I don't know how it is up in Canada, but in the States, companies over a certain size, they have to have the alert line.
Yeah,
Um,
like we're 100%. It's the reality is, especially if you're a global company, is that it's not necessarily that cheap to put it in to put it in place, especially when you're talking different languages and stuff like that. But I 100% agree. It is a must have, and not only just having it, but again, making sure people are aware of it and making sure people feel comfortable calling the line and things like that. It's almost like a two pronged thing. It's to have it and then push it out and make sure people are 100% aware that it exists, because yeah, you're totally right. I totally agree with you. So, because the irony is too, I remember I was working at one place where guy gets fired, and it's that which triggered, he gets fired, he goes home the next day, and then he calls in and say, yeah, you fired me. How about employee XYZ who's doing all this other stuff? And it shouldn't take someone to get fired in order to, report all of that stuff, right? So,
well, and when you retaliate against whistleblowers, people know it. I
yeah,
was a whistleblower. I was retaliated against, and no one used the alert line I heard in my group ever, because they saw what happened.
yeah, no, that's disappointing. Yeah. The other group I wanted to just touch on, Kelly, is not for profits. And obviously not for profits are going to be high up on the list just because the nature, there's a lot of them are small organizations, obviously, tight on cash. They're supposed to break even. You know what I mean? But what I wanted to specifically talk about is that many professionals sit as directors on not-for-profits. Maybe they sit on the audit committees of not-for-profits. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, number one, I guess, are not-for-profits high on the list in terms of, susceptible to fraud? And number two, if you're a director on these, like what should you be doing in terms of trying to make sure that, that when there's an issue, that it's dealt with appropriately?
Yeah. So again, we live in the United States. We're a very litigious, society. If I were to be on a not-for-profit now, I would make sure that they had, we call it directors and officers insurance. Excuse me. Uh, you can be liable. And if there is a fraud, even if you had nothing to do with it, you could be pulled into it. You have to be very careful about your personal liability if you're going to be on a board, and that's terrible. And small nonprofits can't afford it, but you have to be careful. The other thing with nonprofits is the shame, and it's not even the shame. It's like the publicity of of fraud perpetrated against a nonprofit. There's a lot of problems. Like say your, charter school could be ripped off.
Yeah.
Maybe the parents are going to say, I don't want my kids to go there because I don't know if it's going to be able to survive this. So you don't announce it. And then it's not good. They worry that they will lose donors. And
Yeah.
sure enough,
Yeah.
some people are going to say, well, they weren't even paying attention to my money, so I'm not going to give them money. There's a big conversation that has to take place about that. But as an officer, you have a fiduciary responsibility to the nonprofit. So, if it's a little HOA or something like that, you're like, no one's ever going to happen. My HOA, some guy is suing the board for something. I'm like, It's like, I wouldn't get near it. Do your due diligence before you get on a not-for-profit. I would also say to have some type, if you can afford it, an audit that clear shows the books are clean before you get on. So there is like a demarcation line. And had friends that have volunteered for like PTAs, and they're like, "What?" And that's like, just, you know what? Make sure the books are clean before you start.
And if there is an issue, should they be calling somebody like Kelly Paxton to get in there, like an external person to come in and take a look? Like, is that almost like a 10 out of 10? Like, you need to do that no matter what in order to satisfy your fiduciary responsibility that you're doing the right thing? That it gets some sort of a third party like yourself who's experienced in these, who, typically knows where the bodies are buried in order to look around and make sure you get to the bottom of it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't do investigations anymore. I finally just gave up my private investigator license in the state of Oregon. I consult. I have lots of referrals. Sometimes because they're nonprofits, law enforcement is more interested because it is like a community based and they can help you.
Yeah.
But y- again, I hate to let's say, attorneys, but most nonprofits do have attorneys, and make sure that, they are skilled and capable in that. But if you're a not profit and you think that there's something going on, try to find someone to help you, like in the private sector. But if you can't, go to law enforcement. But I want to say tread lightly. Like when I was younger, I was on nonprofits. I'm like, man, now as I've gotten older, I'd be a little bit more careful just because of personal liability, the potential for it. I think I think they're wonderful. I mean, I give to nonprofits. Would I give to a nonprofit if I knew they had been ripped off? I don't know. I don't know. It depends on the size of it, probably.
Yeah.
I'm pretty picky. I could give to small ones.
And it would probably depend on the nature of the fraud, right? Like
Right.
like if the CEO ripped off the place, that, like the person that founded it is all of a sudden. But if it was, maybe again, like just a random employee who walked away with, 5 grand or something like that, it wasn't a big deal. Yet it hit the newspaper for whatever reason because they were prominent. It might depend on the nature, you know what I mean, in terms of how you would base your decisions. But it's not good. And that was the other thing I just wanted to just talk to you a little bit about, Kelly, is the after effects of all of this. Is you had a fraud, you found the person, you did it. I asked that same investigator that I talked with, his name is Chris Mathers. Chris says, again, I quote Chris all the time. And I'd ask Chris, I said, what should you do with when this when this happens? Like how do you kind of prevent and deal with these issues going forward? And he said, Scott, he goes back in like the Middle Ages, in the medieval times. He goes, when somebody went across, when someone did something against the king, he goes, they would hunt that person down, they would chop his head off, and they would stake it out in front of the castle so that everybody would know what would happen. His point being is that if you're victimized, one of the ways to communicate it out to the rest of employees is to basically blast it out and tell everybody, you do this, this is the end of you. These behaviors are not acceptable. What is your best practice, Kelly, in terms of you've been burned, and trying to set a good corporate culture? What should people do next? Do you think that's a good strategy, or do you think there's maybe another way to go at it?
You need to be consistent. And I think the larger the corporation is, the harder it is to be consistent.
Yeah.
You can find yourself in all sorts of legal issues if you aren't consistent. So say the administrative assistant, spends $5,000 on Amazon and she gets prosecuted, yet the, C-suite executive sends their buddy, a very lucrative contract that gets kicked back, and you don't do anything, you let them resign. People know.
Yeah.
So I would say being consistent, it also keeps you out of more legal trouble in the States. It's like, when I was investigator at Nike, you had to calibrate. And it's like, this person gets this punishment, everyone else, it should be similar. Like you can't just have a person here and then this person gets this, because, well, what if that person, is in a protected class or blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I would say be consistent, give as much information as you can to the employees without um, causing potential liability to you and the business itself. So you said something which I want to backtrack on just a little bit, because I get this question. I'm the CEO. I knew nothing about this fraud, yet they're firing me. And it's like, so there are numerous cases. There's a guy in New Mexico or Arizona. He ran a nonprofit for one of the tourist bureaus. He had nothing to do with the fraud. Yet the board said, see ya.
Yeah.
So you can have nothing to do with it. Yet it happens on your watch and it taints you. So if you go in all cavalier, like, well, we did everything right, your board still may say it's kind of like no confidence. We don't have confidence in you. So just because you had nothing to do with it, you can prove you had nothing to do with it, there's still potentially is going to be no confidence. So, remember that also. Just because you're that high up doesn't mean that bad things can't happen to your career.
Because it's one thing not to know, and anybody can claim they didn't know, and the question is, especially for accountants in the room, is should you have known? And, I'll bet you 9 times out of 10, or even higher than that, the answer to that question is yes. We should have known. We should have known better. We should have spoken to people like you, Kelly, who gave us the best practices on how to do it. We should have read your book. We should have made better controls. We should have known better. You know what I mean? And even a lot of CEOs are pretty financially astute. They can't, you can't just trust without verify. There has to be some element of verify. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah. And, in this world of social media, all it
Yeah.
takes is, I'm not going to say one bad tweet, because hopefully you're not on X, but one, post on TikTok or Instagram or something like that. Your reputation can go like this instantly. We have never seen this in our world before. So your social reputation is so incredibly important. Yeah, it's just the world acts too quickly. So this is my one thing, is to slow down. We got to slow down. And, everyone wants to get stuff done, like, up. And it's like, we've got to slow down. And I always think that that's another thing auditors are good for. And I'm not going to say like the big four auditors, because they're billed, by time and stuff like that. But in we have a lot of, business email compromise. Slow down. Is that the right email? What's that
100%.
period doing in between?
100%.
Yeah, we need to slow down. And everyone wants action. I got to get it done today. And if someone wants action from you, that's a red flag.
100%. We do not, you make a great point, Kelly. We do not operate in the medical field where if we fail to make a decision, somebody could die. I mean, that's not that, or in the military or in the police, where, these first responders, where literally every decision there, or a sizable amount of their decisions are life or death decisions. And I feel, that's a very, very difficult, a very difficult field to operate in. The beauty in our field in accounting is that we can slow it down. If a wire doesn't go out today, it's not the end of the world. The lawyers will just redraft the documents and push it for another couple days. Yeah, people might be pissed off, but no one's dying. You know what I mean? And maybe it costs us a couple extra bucks. But end of the day, if you're not comfortable with something, you need to slow it down to a grinding halt until you're comfortable, getting it over the line. I think that's great advice. I think that's a great perspective to have. So, and when you catch somebody, would you recommend, in almost all cases, you take it to the, as they say, take it to the mattresses, you prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law? Because again, I could imagine there's a lot of businesses that look at the math and say, they stole 20 grand, it's going to cost me 25 in legal fees. Screw it. Fire them and move on. And if they go and land and, at the company down the street, that's the company down the street's problem, not mine anymore.
I always want victims to go to law enforcement. And again, down in the States, the legal system, I had a client, it took them 3.5 years to get a resolution. They had to pay a lawyer the whole entire time. They were able to. How many people can do that. And mentally, listen,
Absolutely.
mentally, the torture of it.
Absolutely.
And like, I always recommend to do it, but you need to understand that there is no CSI embezzlement 1 hour episode. It is years. And this goes to like you said, Chris Mathers. I call myself a fraud therapist because I'm cheaper to cry on my shoulder than on the attorney's shoulder. I've seen it more than most attorneys have seen it. You are gutted. These are people,
Yeah.
especially if you're a business on Main Street, these are people you've had it in your life, in your home. They may have babysat your children. Their kids may go to school with your kids. You are devastated. And then you start questioning every decision. You're like, how did I not see that? How did I not see it? And so you start questioning. And yeah, it causes you to slow down, but you're like, well, if I made a bad decision about that hire, well, maybe this contract isn't the right decision for me. So it's, I don't want to say it's like a bad divorce, but it kind of is because lawyers
Absolutely.
are involved. And then you question all your decisions. Like, why didn't I do this sooner? Or I had that gut reaction. Like when she showed up in the brand new Escalade, I should have done something then. Like,
Absolutely.
so the mental torture of it, and it is torture because you're second guessing, third guessing yourself. And then a lot of business owners are embarrassed about it.
Yeah.
Like they're like, aren't you a master of the universe? How did you let Gladys steal that kind of money from you? So that's like, I mean, I would say not only hiring a lawyer, you need therapy. The
Yeah.
woman who took 3.5 years, she told me a couple of years after this happened, because we met each other in person, and she said that she was ready to check herself into a psych ward. And I
I
have
agree.
email.
Oh no, this totally understandable. I totally agree with you. And I think, we, again, another accounting concept is a sunk cost.
Yeah.
It's done out of out of sight, out of mind. I don't want to wake up every morning with some email from my lawyer about how I need to answer 60 questions on what happened here. You know what I mean? Is I want it, but you're almost living up to a greater good and saying, look, I need to do this because it's the right thing to do. You know what I mean? And I need to move on. I need to move on with I need to make sure that the person doesn't walk down the street and go victimize someplace else. You know what I mean? Especially too, if you're a member of a professional body like a CPA, you owe it to the CPA organization to call out your members who are not behaving the way they should be behaving if they are a CPA. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
So, to Kelly, to wrap up, when should we call you? You spend a lot of time doing speeches. Again, go to your website. You got a really cool website. Again, I would highly recommend you read the book. And I'm sure you get 1,000 calls. But for people listening, when should they give you a call? What are the different services you provide, and how do you help out with companies, both large and small?
So, like I said, I'm no longer a private investigator, but I do consult. I love my speaking and training because as an investigator, I called it whack-a-mole. Like you take
Yeah.
one person out. But I just spoke at a credit union in the Midwest, 400 people, CEOs in the front row the whole entire day. I am telling 400 people, and it wasn't on pink collar, it was on ethics, but 400 people. And the mushroom effect of that is so huge. And, there's been behavioral science work done that a lot of companies, once a year, the C-suite or the higher ups, they sign out, I will behave. It's like, good behavior policy. You can't do it once a year. It's like running a marathon once a year. You don't do it without training. Ethics is a muscle, and you need to you need to be doing it all the time. I mean, I joke, and I told my friend this. She's just like, she always does white lies. Ever since I've known her in 4th grade, she's been white lies. She white lies 6 days a week. She goes to church on Sunday, and she's like, I'm good for the next week. You can't do that. You just can't.
Yep.
So you got to walk the talk. You got to have the culture. And I think my presentations about culture and ethics really mushroom, and it makes people think. And I promise I will never play ethics Jeopardy.
Well, I think you'd be interested in knowing the answer to this question is that if you look at if you look at any of those pink collar crimes that you've investigated, and if you were to ascribe blame, obviously the person who took the money or committed the crime is going to bear most of the blame. What percentage would you put on the culture that existed? Because the answer is not zero. I think the corporate culture, whatever it may be, whether maybe they look the other way when other situations happened, or again, they don't talk about this stuff. The answer is not zero. The corporate culture is definitely going to play a factor, but I'd be interested to know, Kelly, in your experience, what do you think that number is? Maybe it's not 50-50, maybe it is. I don't know. I'd be interested to get your perspective.
The bigger the corporation, the culture it's much harder to control.
Yeah.
Much, much harder to control. The smaller, I'm going to say I like to work on Main Street because like, I don't know if I have the numbers exactly right, but the average fraud on Main Street is like half the dollar amount is in, say, a Fortune 500, but a Fortune 500 company can absorb it.
Yeah.
They really can't. They have insurance, they can absorb it. The ones on Main Street, they'll go out of business. They'll lay people off.
Yep.
That's where I like my work to affect, because I'm not going to say the Fortune 100 or 500 are, it's not a problem, because it is a problem. And we do pay higher prices for widgets or whatever like that. But you can really see it in the smaller, like, I don't want to say mom and pop, but, not the ones that
Absolutely.
have legions of general counsel and outside counsel and, they've got all that sort of stuff. When a fraud happens, it really hurts Main Street.
Agreed. I totally agree with you. Well, Kelly, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time, and yeah, I hope we chat again soon. But thanks again for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for supporting the book and spreading the word on pink collar crime, because it's the crime of Main Street.
Well said. Well, good way to finish. Thank you very much, Kelly.
Thank you.
Well, that wraps another episode of CSI Chat, and I really wanted to thank everybody for listening. If you want to keep up to date on CSI Chat, I would encourage everyone to join our CSI Chat LinkedIn group and or follow us on Twitter/X under CSI Chat. With that, I will get you out of here on a high note with some music, and thanks again.
Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with the clever accountant who's got your back. We'll mystery's never done. We'll see the case through.